on thinking not only about disability, but also about the intersections of disability, race, and other marginalized identities, and how and special education supports. So I'm really excited about this topic and really excited to speak with you all this morning. So again, I am the director of the Midwestern Plains Equity Assistance Center. We are one of 4 federally funded equity assistance center to provide, we provide equity-focused technical assistance to public K-12 education systems. And the equity assistance centers are legislated out of Title IV of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And we are funded out of the U.S. Department of Education, specifically we are administered out of the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. So many of our regions overlap in terms of the school systems that we support. Our region is Region 3, and we support the states that you see here on this slide. So the 6 states that are in crimson, and then the 7 additional states that are in gold. Some of the resources and the ways in which we support, provide supports to public K-12 systems, and that's including local school districts or school buildings, as well as state education agencies. We provide educational research and resources, primarily through our website, and just a plethora of digital print resources, multimedia resources, various different online learning opportunities. We have a really comprehensive equity resource library that includes tools and other research products. And all of those resources are accessible to anyone and everyone who has access to the internet and a computer can download those resources at no cost. And please visit our website, please download our resources and share them with the families that you work with and with the schools that you work with as well. In addition to providing resources and research products, we also convene various different learning opportunities by creating and supporting equity learning networks. And so we bring together educators, we bring together community members, stakeholders, and families for shared learning and networking opportunities. One of our biggest events is coming up actually this week, and it's our Equity Leaders Institute, which is a 2-day intensive learning experience. Every year it's annual, and every year we focus on a different topic. This year we're focusing on anti-oppressive pedagogy. So it's really focused on classroom teachers and curriculum directors on creating inclusive and supportive classroom instruction for all learners. In addition to that, we have our Learning Network cohorts in which people can sign up to be members of and experience professional learning experiences, tool showcases, webinars, and virtual roundtables. And then we also, when invited, present on various different opportunities and convenings like this one. In addition to our equity learning networks, we support specific school districts and buildings and state departments who are interested in engaging in transformative, comprehensive, equity-focused transformational work. And so these partners are partners that work with us over multiple years on specific mutually defined equity goals. Those goals are then codified in what we call an MOU. And from those goals, we create what we call a technical assistance scope and sequence, and really work alongside our partners in engaging in equity work to help meet those goals. And that work can include a regularly scheduled consultation calls, includes customized partner-specific professional learning. It includes facilitated focused planning, policy reviews, staff professional learning experiences, and a whole series of sort of comprehensive, you could think about it as almost wraparound services for school districts. And again, all of these services are at no cost to our public LEAs and SEAs that who reside within our region. In addition to that, we engage in continuous improvement at works. We are a learning organization, and continuous improvement is very important to us. So we engage in a variety of continuous improvement activities, including regional needs sensing, collecting ongoing data, both formative and summative data, to help improve both our internal efficiencies and also to gauge the impact of our services in the region. And then we engage in various different outreach and engagement opportunities to make sure that families and school systems know who we are and know how to access our systems. And we leverage a number of our social media platforms to get the word out about the products and opportunities that we have at our center. So that's about what I do. But I want to focus now and shift the gears a little bit to talking about what I want to engage with in conversation this morning. And I really would like this to be a conversation. So we have a couple of activities as well as sharing important information. Specifically, we want to talk about the importance of implying an intersectional approach to supporting youth and adults with disabilities. Understanding that our youth with disabilities also embody other social identities, and many of those identities are also marginalized in our communities and in our school systems. So how do we take an intersectional approach? How do we look at the whole child and not only focus on supporting supports that are related to their disability, but also how their disabilities and how they experience their disability is mediated through their other intersecting identities. And then what can we do as support, as technical assistance providers and supports to families and school systems to make sure that they are attending to the variety, wonderful, rich way, all of the rich dimensions that our young people bring into our communities, into our school systems. The disability community is the largest minoritized group in this country. And because anyone at any time can become disabled, it is also the most diverse community as well. So when we think about the disability community, we need to imagine and reflect all the different ways in which disabled bodies show up, right? All the different identities that people with disabilities have, and the extent to which those identities intersect with each other. Those identities help shape experiences, help shape worldviews, help shape the assets that we all bring, as well as some of the challenges that we experience. Go back. When we think about the diversity within the disability community, I want to sort of break down and share a couple of statistics or just numbers with you all. So in terms of race and ethnicity, only 1 in 5 adults with disabilities are white. So think about that. Only 1 in 5 are white. So that the ethnic diversity, the racial diversity, the language diversity in terms of national origin. When we think about the disability community, we're thinking about a rich milieu of individuals within the disability community. 86% of students ages 3 to 27 that are served and that receive special education services are children of color. 86% of students are students of color. So again, when we think about support for youth with disabilities, we think about services within our schools, we cannot separate the supports around disability as well as supports related to children diversity in terms of their race, their ethnicity, and their language. More than 1/3 of LGBTQ adults identify as having disability. More than 1/3. People living in economically disadvantaged communities, over 25% of people with disabilities live in poverty as compared to 11% of non-disabled people. And over 12% of people who identify as female are also disabled. So again, we think about a disability community, we have to think about the rich diversity that resides within our community of disabled peoples. So I want to share a little bit about myself and how I situate myself in this work. I was born with a disability, and I received all of my public K-12 experience as a student with a disability supported in special education programs. I have what is often theoretical for many TA providers in terms of understanding the kind of experiences that students with disabilities face. Those experiences are not theoretical to me. Those experiences are my lived experience. As a public school student, as a public school student who lived in a large urban city, I understand the challenges that my family faced, as well as the challenges that I faced in accessing supports and resources. In addition to my own personal experience as being a child with a disability, a student with a disability, a young adult with a disability, a college student with a disability, I also began my career as a school psychologist within special education. So I have experience, if you will, both sides of the table. As a special education practitioner, who work with educators, who work with families, who work with students in providing special education supports and ensuring that students have access to the appropriate supports. And I bring that knowledge to bear to this experience, but also, again, as a recipient of those services. I started my career in Head Start, so I know what it feels like to work with very young students. And to work with a program that really values and prizes the contributions, the authentic contributions of families and parents. And my focus has always been on inclusive education. How do we create educational experiences that are inclusive, that are supportive, that are responsive to all students? When I started my career, my focus was on creating environments that were inclusive for students with disabilities. And in fact, my research was in that area. But what I learned very early in my career, that when we're talking about inclusive environments, we're really talking about creating inclusive schools. We're talking about creating inclusive learning environments that are responsive and appreciative and value all diversity. And so what we're really talking about is equity. And how do we create equitable learning environments that dismantle barriers to access for diverse adults and diverse children, that dismantle barriers to opportunities, that dismantle barriers to resources. And so in order to realize, truly realize inclusive communities, in order to truly realize inclusive workplaces, in order to really realize inclusive schools, we have to focus on advancing equity, because equity is about dismantling all barriers that prevent a truly authentic, inclusive environment. You can have diversity and not have inclusion, right? You can have diverse people, diverse students in learning together and not truly have inclusive environments. And I myself personally experienced that when I was a child and I was quote unquote mainstreamed into general education classroom from being in a self-contained special education classroom and experience being a part of a classroom, but not actually included in that general education classroom. I experienced really being separated and segregated, even though I shared the same space. So we're talking more about just putting children together. We're talking about really creating community within our learning spaces by breaking down barriers,
Yeah,
opportunities.
I'm cooking for you.
Yes. Is there a question? Okay. So it's a little bit about me and sort of what I bring to this talk today and what I bring to the work that I do. I want to talk a little bit about then how do our inequities show up through an intersectional lens, right? And so many of us are familiar with the data around the data related to disabilities, the students with disabilities. But I want to look at data through an intersectional lens, meaning that we're looking at data through not only disability, but also disability at the intersection of race. So here are some statistics and some facts for us. White children ages 3 to 5 are more likely to be served under Part B than Asian children, Black children, or African-American children. This is from the 2020 annual report to Congress. Babies from non-low income backgrounds were 26% more likely to have developmental screenings than babies from low income backgrounds. So in the first statistic, we're talking about disability at the intersection of race and ethnicity. The second statistic is talking about disability or developmental delay at the intersection of disability or delay and income. Black children with developmental delays are 44%, and Latinx children are 78% less likely to be identified and receive services, early intervention services. So again, we're talking about disability or delay at the intersection of race and national origin or ethnicity. So these are early childhood services, but let's see if we do any better in school-age services. When we look at a couple of statistics related to school-age supports, among Black students, again, disability at the intersection of race, served under IDEA who exited school during the 2017-18 school year, only 2/3 graduated with a regular high school diploma, which was the lowest rate compared to students of other racial ethnic groups. Among students with disabilities in the same income bracket, students of color have a higher probability of being placed in a substantially separate classroom than their white peers. And this difference is at a greater magnitude when we take income into account. So at the intersection of race and income and disability. So when we look at who gets to spend more time in general education classrooms and inclusive environments at the intersection of race and disability, and specifically at the intersection of race, disability, and income, we see disparities, we see inequities. When we look at the outcomes in terms of like a graduation, in terms of the regular high school diploma, again, at the intersection of race and disability, we see inequities. Let's look at transition services, because maybe things may be a little bit different when we think about transitions. So young adults with disabilities of color receive fewer vocational training opportunities, fewer college and university opportunities, and are less likely to be placed in competitive employment positions. The availability of supports, voc rehab supports, and other information like from American Job Centers or independent living centers are often not shared with young adults of color with disabilities and their families. So we think about the information, who gets the information and who does not get the information. Again, at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and disability, we see disparities or inequities. VR counselors tend to support and train clients in the same way, regardless of race and ethnicity. And these approaches are often not appealing or relevant to clients of color. So when we think about the experiences that young children, young babies have with disabilities or delays, that are young babies of color, or young children of color, in terms of early intervention, when we think about school-age experiences, when we think about transition services, when we think about post-secondary experiences, we see inequities throughout. In fact, over 30 years of transition research demonstrate that the youth of disabilities, youth of color disabilities face additional challenges and limited access to career opportunities. These disparities are also evident in college enrollment and employment and most post-educational outcomes. So there's a lot to think about when we not only focus on disability, but when we focus on disability through an intersectional lens at the intersection of race, national origin or ethnicity, language, gender identity, and income. So at this point, I'm not, McKinney, I don't know if it's possible if we can do breakouts. Can we do breakouts?
Yes, how many rooms do you need?
Just equal, so maybe, I think we have about, how many people do we have?
40.
So let's have maybe 5 breakout rooms.
5 breakout. Okay, let's see. So, do you have instructions for them once they
Yeah.
happen?
Yes, I'm going to show my screen again.
Okay, and then I'll wait for that so they know what they're doing before they're sent there.
Absolutely. So in your breakout rooms, the first thing I would like for you to do is just take the time to greet each other. And if you're able to enable your camera, that'd be great. And just take time to sort of greet each other in your breakout rooms. And then I would like you to think about 2 things. We're going to do a wow and wonder. I want you to discuss what wowed you. So what surprised you? What aha moment that you had as I walked through the statistics around early intervention or supports to young children, school age opportunities, and also post educational outcomes for students with disabilities at the intersection of other minoritized identities. So what wowed you? What were some ahas? Or what were some surprises? So that's the first point you're going to discuss. The second discussion point is then what do you wonder about? So what additional questions? So we're doing a wow and a wonder. What wowed you about the data I shared? And what questions, what do you wonder about? And just sort of discuss that in your small group. Then we'll come back together. We have about 5 minutes for that. So it's a quick discussion. We'll come back together and just kind of have a whole group share out.
Okay, so make a note of the 2 things, the aha moments, and then what extra questions, because you won't be able to see those on the chat, even if I add them in there. And now we're gonna be, you're gonna be assigned automatically to one of the 5 groups. I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Thank you. So no, Seena, do you want me to set a timer or are you good?
Did you,
I'll set a timer.
yeah, that'll be
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I can write the aha moments in here. I can do a broadcast to all.
Okay, just, yeah, thank you. How are you doing today?
I'm excited, but it's nerve-wracking, you know, it's like, oh, the last minute thing. And you are the first. So I thought, oh my gosh, she's gonna get that crunch because I wouldn't have that private time to ask you the extra questions.
Oh,
So I appreciate you, you know, the flexibility in the recording part too.
oh, absolutely. And my apologies for things have just been so really, really busy at the center. We're onboarding new staff. And so my apologies for not getting things to you sooner. I do apologize.
Seena, do not apologize, because I knew that I needed to be, that I could be more in contact with you guys, you know, like a little closer, and I just couldn't, because, you know, it's like good reminders and all that, but we also had a loss at work, and she was out for 4 weeks. It's a COVID loss. So our administrative assistant. So it doesn't matter that people are here, because we had the loss. Like, she was out for 4 weeks, and then we had to deal with she leaving us for real. So
I'm so sorry.
yeah. So it's that crunch. So I kind of knew, but actually appreciate that you guys. I just wanted to know that you will be there. It's fine. This group is willing to. You know, it's just searching for all this information. So nobody asked for extra questions, you know, it's more like people that work. So thank you. Don't apologize. I knew that I could do even better and just couldn't, but we were here. So
yes. Good group. good number of people registered.
Yes,
That's
they're
great.
frontline. Very few are directors.
Mhm. That's
And
great.
Anna is a frontline and art director too for the smaller groups. So
Mhm. I'm glad that we're able to do the breakout. I should have emailed that yesterday. And I was like, oh, I should have told Seena. I hope we can do it. So I know I put you on the spot, but so I'm glad we're able to do it.
I couldn't even practice that without having a person. So, but I knew that lately it's easier and easier to handle those things in there.
Mm-hmm.
Too bad that I'm missing but I needed to breathe too. So.
Mm-hmm.
This is so interesting. I'm able to see, and maybe the ones that were here, like who did not join and the reasons, like Mel is staff person. So this is amazing how I can see like who is there and who did not join. Did you want me to give them a 60-second heads up?
Sure. Let me see how much time is left.
I think we're a minute 4 already, isn't it?
Hey, Nelsinia.
Yes.
I have taken attendance and I've got 41 people and I have it saved on the computer if you'd like.
That's great, Mel. And don't feel that you have to stick with us, although you're more than welcome. You're super helpful. I appreciate your help.
Of course. Okay, I'll email this to you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course.
No, see, we can close out. We have about 60 seconds left, so we can start closing the rooms whenever you're ready.
So when I do that, it gives them 60 seconds, right?
Exactly. Yeah, automatically.
Oh.
Welcome back.
That was quick.
Thank you, railing people in. This is a good group to have those breakout rooms too. So I'm pretty sure they're having a lot of it good.
Oh yeah, we were surprised, like, oh, we're going back. We were just getting, hit up.
I know time goes by really fast.
Yeah.
So Marbella, Ohio. Yes.
Yes.
Welcome back, everyone. I always, when the Zoom brings people back, I always think about Star Trek when folks are beaming back to, up to the spaceship or whatever. Okay, so you've had a chance, as people are coming back, to kind of talk a little bit. I know 5 minutes wasn't a lot of time, but I hope you had a chance to sort of just share some initial thoughts. So just a couple of folks share out, what were some of the highlights from your discussion? Let's start with the wow. So what wowed you about the data that I shared? What surprised you, if anything surprised you about it?
Remember that you can unmute yourself if you want to talk, or you can raise your hand too, and we'll be calling. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think that we in our group had wows. I mean, we know the statistics, and as some people said, they walk that walk daily. So we all agreed we weren't wowed. I mean, you wowed us, but not, I mean, we realized the statistics. It's the wonder of how to engage people in their own biases, my biases, how to, I guess, have people with lived experience at the table also. I think that's what our group talked about a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Other
Anyone
thoughts?
from any other group?
Yeah, is it Vicky? Victoria?
Victoria? Yes. Hi. So my wow wasn't so much the statistics, like we've said, we walk the walk, we talk the talk, we see these statistics very often in our work. But my wow is more so, how are we still not making a change? That's my wow. Like the change is very slow and incremental, and it's not like we know we need to do better, let's change it right now. It's not more of a drastic change. That's my wow.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much research and statistics it will take to get these things completely changed. That's my wonder.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. Let's do one more. One more group.
This is Karen in Iowa. And in group 3, we were talking about how so much of the data that we have to work from right now is so incorrect. And so it makes it difficult for us to know what to do when we know there's such egregious amounts of both overrepresentation and underrepresentation. And then that led us into a conversation about differences in diagnoses between different groups. And so if you don't have good solid data to pull from, how do you answer the questions about what you need to do about it?
Yep. So we're going to talk about, so what do you do, right, in just a few seconds. But I want to stay in this space just for a second in terms of the data, right? Because that's a really big piece of this conversation. And often when we think about the data, we look at the data that I showed, which is often sort of the outcome data. So we look at outcome data often. What we don't necessarily look at a lot is some of the input data, right? So I also showed some of the input data. What I mean by input data, who's receiving services, right? Who's in those general education classrooms, disaggregated by disability and by race and ethnicity, and often economic status. What kinds of experiences? So who's accessing those kinds of transition supports and the quality of those transition supports? Those are all input data. They're about the system, and they're about the kinds of experiences that our children with disabilities have that contributes to then the outcome, that contributes to the extent to which students are receiving regular diplomas versus alternative diplomas, or actually being enrolled in college or university after post-secondary, or in a viable work situation, which is sort of the outcomes. And so one of the sort of the levers that you all can use in your role is to surface some of the input data for the schools and the families that you're working with, to kind of hold a mirror up and say, when you're talking about outcome like suspension and expulsion, we're talking about over or underrepresentation in receiving special education services. Let's talk about what's happening in special education services, though, right? Let's talk about what's happening in transition planning. Let's talk about what's happening in the screening and evaluation process for young children, what those supports look like, because it's those supports that are informing then the outcomes that we see. So that's sort of one area, one lever you can kind of use. Also, when we think about showing the data, and particularly when you're being confronted with data, right, from school systems, to what extent are you being shown data that's disaggregated by different groups? And then what are the questions then that you're asking? And so these are the kinds of ways that we can sort of leverage data in a way that will prompt school systems to ask questions about their system. And as a consultant, as a technical assistance provider, that's one of our major roles, is to not give the answers necessarily, but to create the conditions where the right questions can be asked of administrators, of school personnel about their own system, and to leverage data in such a way that would prompt those questions. So that's just some thoughts around how you can use data as a lever to begin to make that movement that you're talking about in terms of changing the outcomes that we see. So I'm going to share my screen again and move us forward. Thank you so much for sharing your highlights from your table, from your breakout discussion. So let's move into then what we need to think about as a system, as systems, to begin to make that shift. So how do we ensure that we have environments and a future where all students and families benefit from special education, actually benefit from special education, right? Because special education in and of itself can be beneficial, but it can also be a hindrance. And there are some students that benefit from special education services, but there are many students who do not benefit from special education services. And I mean benefit in a couple of ways. I mean benefit in terms of being able to access services, being able to receive services, but also while they're in services, the quality of the special education services that they receive. And to what extent is the quality supportive of all students, who we begin to look at the inequities within the quality of services. And so we do this again by accounting for and appreciating the multiple dynamic cultures of our education system. So every single institution, every single organization, we are navigating and interacting with multiple cultures within any system that we are navigating. We're continuing with cultures that people bring with them. And so each and every one of us, each student, each adult, each educator, each parent brings with them their own cultural histories and cultural practices. And those cultural histories and practices inform and shape who they are, their expectations, their values, and the extent and the experiences within the educational system. But that's not those aren't the only cultures that are at play in any system, in this case, in our school systems, because there are cultures that are already established. There are institutional cultures, there are cultures, there's ways of being and ways of doing schooling in the United States, right? And there are practices that are implemented, that are transmitted, down the line that can either be in match and supportive of the cultural histories and practices that children and family and educators bring, or it can be a mismatch or at odds, right? And so these institutional cultures are the traditions, are the norms. They're often codified in policy, whether the policy is written or whether the policy is sort of an informal, unwritten policy. But these are the cultural practices that are established. And then there's this third space, this third domain of culture or cultures. And these are the cultures that we create. So these are the cultures that are created when people work together to co-create norms, to co-create the ways in which we're going to interact, the rules that guide the ways in which we're going to interact and relate to one another. And in every social situation, in every classroom, in every school building, in every district, in every organization, in every community, there are multiple cultures at play that are interacting with each other. If we are not intentional in creating cultures, co-creating cultures and spaces that are inclusive and that are equitable, then the system is at risk of reproducing the same inequities, the same systems of oppression that are evident in our community and our society. So we can't just think about, okay, well, we have students in our schools and they're learning together. And so that's going to bring about inclusive learning environments, or that's going to bring about equitable learning environments, unless we're intentional about bringing about and creating environments that are equitable. We can implement programs and frameworks like MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support, or PBIS, like positive behavior intervention supports, or SEL, like social emotional learning, or any other kind of program that's instituted in our schools. We can implement those programs, but if we're not intentional about ensuring that those programs are incorporating equitable practices, if we're not intentional about equity being the focus of those programs, then those programs in and of themselves will not create equitable learning and inclusive learning spaces. What we are at risk in doing is actually replicating and recreating the marginalized systems that those very frameworks are purported to address. So we have seen in school systems that have implemented MTSS. We have seen in school systems that have implemented positive behavior support. So we have seen the disproportionality, the overrepresentation of particular groups receiving in tier 2 and tier 3, the same type of disproportionality that we see in the sort of older traditional model of test and place, right? So we have seen where schools that have implemented PBIS, while the overall suspension rate has gone down across the board, we still see overrepresentation or disproportionate disciplinary actions based on race and gender in those schools. And so that tells us that in and of itself, those programs are not necessarily will bring about equity outcomes unless we're intentional about creating environments that are focused on equity. And when we talk about those environments that are focused on equity, we're talking about environments that are specifically designed with the focus in mind to dismantle barriers to access, to opportunities, to representation. So we want to think about how these different cultures interact with each other so that we can create a culture, create a classroom culture, create a school culture, create a district culture, create ways in which we interact with communities and families and parents in our schools that are truly authentically inclusive and truly authentically equitable. And we do this by, again, taking an intersectional approach. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between intersectional identities and intersectionality, because often these terms are used interchangeably and are really sort of misused to mean the same thing, but they're actually very different. So when we talk about intersectional identities, each and every one of us, every single person embodies multiple identities, social identities. And these identities are a part of who we are, and they shape our experiences, and they shape how we view the world, our worldview, and how we experience the world, how the world experiences us. So if I were to sort of break down and enumerate the multiple identities that I possess, just a few of them, I identify as a cisgendered woman. So I'm cisgender, meaning that my biological sex is a match with my gender identity. So I identify as female and my biological sex is female. I identify as an African-American. I also identify as Black, meaning that I identify as part of the African diaspora across the globe, and understand that there's some common experiences and common cultural values and practices, but I also identify with the unique experience of the unique African-American experience in this country as being a descendant of enslaved Blacks in this country. And so I have those both identities that I identify. I identify as Christian. I identify as heterosexual. I identify as a person with a disability, and I identify as a disabled person, meaning that I identify as a person with a disability But I also accept that my disability as part of my social identity. So I identify as both. I'm a Midwestern girl. So I identify as being from the Midwest. I identify as being from middle class. My home language, my heritage language is English, and more specifically to the African American English, African American language. And so these are multiple identities that I possess. Some of the identities that I possess are privileged in this country, like my sexual orientation is privileged in this country. My language is being a native English speaker is privileged in this country. My gender identity, the fact that I'm cisgender is privileged in this country. Being a Christian is privileged in this country. So I identify and I embody identities that are privileged in this country, meaning that these are identities that are often held up as the standard way of being and doing. I also embody identities that are marginalized in this country. So being a disabled person is marginalized in this country. Being Black and African American, those identities are marginalized in this country. Right? And so being a woman, being a female is marginalized in this country. So meaning that those identities are not set as sort of the standard way of being and doing, but are in fact seen as sort of marginalized, and often I experience barriers as a part of those identities, barriers that I have to navigate around. And so I embody identities that are both, multiple identities that are both privileged and marginalized. And so my experience as being a person with a disability is mediated through my other identities. So my experience as being disabled is mediated through my steps, through being a woman. So there are issues about my disability that's affected about being a woman with a disability, right? There are additional concerns. There are additional elements and things I have to think about around safety, for example. Right, that a person with disability who may be male may not have to think about in the same way. Right, my identity of being disabled is mediated through my race. So being a person with disability who's Black is different from being a person with disability who's white, and the kinds of different experiences that I have to navigate in terms of discrimination. Right, in terms of the presumed incompetence. So there's a presumed incompetence that's often related to both my disability and also related to my race, right, that I have to navigate around. And so these are the ways in which one of my identities is sort of mediated by the others. When we think about intersectionality, we're talking about the overlapping, intersecting systems of oppression that are associated with various different identities. So intersectionality is the fact that I have to navigate around racism and sexism and ableism as being a Black woman with a disability. And so those systems of oppression and intersecting, overlapping systems that I have to navigate and contend with based on identities that I serve, that I have, and that I embody, that's intersectionality. So intersecting identities are just the different identities that we have and that intersect with one another. Intersectionality are the different systems of oppression that's often connected with those identities. So we have that in mind, an intersectional approach in mind. We think about that in terms of the families and children that we serve. So for example, this particular mother and child have to deal with multiple intersecting at the intersections of multiple systems of oppression, of sexism, racism, and ableism, right? But depending on other identities, they may also have to deal with classism that may serve as barriers to various different opportunities. They may have to contend with linguicism if they are not native English speakers or English is not their home or heritage language. They may have to deal with heterosexism if the student identifies as being transgender or as being not heterosexual, so part of the LGBTQ community. So there are different sort of barriers and systems that children and families have to contend with when we take an intersectional approach. So I'm going to do another quick, I think I have time. How are we doing on time, Ms. Celia? Ms. Celia, your mic is on?
We have 28 minutes.
Okay, good. We're doing good.
Yes.
So we're going to do another breakout. We're going to break out back into the same rooms. If they're already set up, that's fine. Quick conversation, 5 minutes, and just again, another wow and wonder. So just sort of when you think about intersectionality, I want you to think about your first discussion prompt is with that view of thinking about intersectionality and the ways in which you may support or work with families, what new aha moments do you have with that particular view in mind, right? With that particular view in mind. And then what additional questions do you have where you think about the various different systems that families may have to navigate based on their multiple identities and or the systems that you have to navigate, right, based on your multiple identities. So let's do another 5-minute breakout and then we'll come back.
Amazing. It's a treat. I'm even like, whoa. I had to certainly go back and you know, and review it because sometimes I'm like, people are asking for something and things like that, but oh, it's a treat. It's a treat.
So is it, am I doing what you imagine? What, you know?
Yes, I mean, it's no way that it doesn't touch our work. So, and you don't get to hear the specific groups and how I appreciate that. It's like, I don't think I have like spending time on thinking exactly the different groups. And yeah, it definitely makes you think more bigger than what you thought. I honestly, I'm not sure that this group ever had access to what the work that you do because we are the ones working with parents.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see why the directors have them here. We have 41 going, I think 40 at times. I think, and we have 48 registering, you know. So I suspect that one might not be able to do this, come up later, I'm not sure, but this is a good group. I mean, we're more than happy.
Good.
Thank you. You really know your stuff. I told you, I don't think I ever like really have somebody explaining it this way to us.
Thank you. I'm
Disability part, disability, the special ed part, it's like, it's not many people that can speak about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, you know, when I think about my own experience in special education services and how, you know, there was really not a consideration about my other identities when I was receiving special education services, you know, or special education. And so, and I'll talk about that in just a few seconds, but it was like, it was like I was my disability and that was it. It's like, you know, like I was in my disability and that was it. And it wasn't like, there was not a consideration that, yes, I have a disability, but I'm also a girl and I'm also Black. And that means something that sort of, that shapes the way I experience my disability that may be different than the peer who may not be a woman or may not be a girl, may not be female, or a peer that may not be Black and what that means. And so, you know, when we think about that, it brings a different, I think it widens our perspective a little bit and what kinds of issues, you know, so like safety issues, like being disabled and being a woman, that's a whole different layer of sort of safety issues in terms of, you know, vulnerability to sexual assault, in terms of vulnerability of just in terms of like dating, right? And the kinds of supports a young adolescent may need, a young adolescent girl who's also has a disability, and what the kind of supports he or she may need. So it's a lot, you know, there to kind of think about when you open it up and think about the whole person.
Seena, I think that what you just said is super powerful. So if you share it, I'm pretty sure that it's gonna even make us think deeper on a real life. What is like, and not that many of them don't know, but I think it's yeah, it's that personal experience. Aura, hi, welcome. You are here because people are in breakout rooms, but it's only 2 more minutes before they will join us back, okay? So, well, actually 1 minute. I'm gonna start closing the room. Is that okay, Seena? Although I think, yeah, I said 08. Okay, now I'm gonna start doing that, and they will start popping in. People are not volunteering coming back, so that means that is hit up. 19 seconds. Wow.
People are staying in there using all their time.
Nobody came back. You handled this one now. I won't get involved.
You're fine. You're fine.
Welcome back.
Hello. Okay.
Nice to see your faces.
We need so much more time. That's just too little of time.
Yeah.
I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There's a lot to get through, and you guys just have to have me back, and then we'll have more time. I'd love to come back.
But we share this at the quarterly meetings too, so maybe they can come to the quarterly meetings to have further discussion.
Absolutely. So think of these discussions as little sort of appetizer discussions, and then you can sort of dig in a little bit more deeper. So I want to ask about your highlights from your discussion, but I also want to share some personal examples just to kind of make this idea of sort of intersectionality and taking an intersectional approach a little bit more real and concrete. So when I was a student, I'll put it back, sort of center myself, and I was receiving special education services, the focus was on my disability. So it was focused on supports that I needed for my disability. And I was seeing through the lens of disability, but I was not seeing through a lens of being a girl with a disability, right? And so I remember when I started 9th grade, and so I was 14 and started 9th grade, and there was a high school requirement at the time. This is back in the 80s, so I'm letting you all in on my age, but back in the 80s, and there was a high school requirement that everyone had to have swim class. And so I had adaptive swim as a part of my IEP to meet the high school requirement of swim class. And the adaptive swim class was the first period of the day. And all of us students on IEPs had swim the first period of the day. Now, I'm 13 at the time, 13, 14, first year in high school. My disability, the way my disability manifests itself, so if I were in front of you all in person, what you would see, I'm about 4 feet tall, I have significant scoliosis, so I'm short stature, I have significant scoliosis. I have weakness in my arms, so I have difficulty sort of doing my hair because of just the weakness in my arms, which is why I wear my hair straight. And I can pretty much do this hairstyle. That's pretty much it. So beyond that, I can't do it very well. And so as a 14-year-old, as a 13-year-old with swim class, the first period of the day, there was no consideration of my race and the texture of my hair. There was no consideration of my being a girl. There was only like, okay, you have a disability, you need adaptive swim, and adaptive swim is first period, which is like 8 o'clock. So my entire high school year, my hair was out of control the whole time of being a high school freshman. And we think back when you were in high school and how social, how appearance is so important, making friends. And when you think about an intersectional experience, there was no thought about, well, maybe we might move to the end of the day. So at least, there's no concern about self-care. There's not, there was no sort of thinking about my gender, my age, my developmental, age of being an adolescent and the importance of social relationships, particularly being at a high school for the first year, around non-disabled students for the first year. There was no real consideration about my race in terms of just the texture and care, special, but different care of hair, no consideration about that. And so that's an example of not taking an intersectional approach. That's an example of seeing disability and seeing disability, adaptive swim, that's it, right? But if my teachers had a more intersectional approach, then they might have thought about the timing of that swim class. They might have thought about the other aspects of who I am and how that may mediate my disability experience and may mediate the experiences that I was having with non-disabled peers and disabled peers. So that's just an example of sort of the lack of intersectional approach that we often have, right, with educators. Women with disabilities have different safety concerns. Not that men with disabilities or young boys with disabilities don't have safety concerns, they absolutely do, but there are some additional safety concerns that's attributed to being female, as well as attributed to being a person with a disability. And so when we think about intersectionality, we're thinking about the whole person. We're not segmenting the person into parts and pieces. We're not saying disability only. We're saying this is I'm a Black disabled woman with many other identities, and it's seeing me as a whole person. And so that's really important when we work with families, when we work with educators to help see the whole child and not only the disability. Disability is important, but it's not the only aspect about a person, and often disability experience is mediated by other experiences and other identities. So I just wanted to sort of share that sort of example from my own childhood. So I'll pause there and open the discussion to just a couple of highlights from small group. Dara, your highlight. I don't know if that means you wanted to say something or.
Any reports? Don't be shy. I don't get to see everyone, so if you raise your hand, just join us, please.
Just highlights from your breakout discussion.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
Okay. Not a problem. Anyone want to share?
Sure, I'll share. So we were talking about the change and how, like someone had brought up how I had said that it's slow moving, and there was a statement about how we move forward, and there was a really interesting perspective that said, well, we are the change, but in the same time, these cultures have existed separately for so long that someone said that we should create we need to create a co-culture where it encompasses all of these things. And we're looking at people as people first and the supports that they need. That's what I took from our group discussion. But I think that someone had said that looking at some of these things, like especially for people with color, you see a Black woman first. And it's so entrenched in our society that when discipline is happening in school, it's done without even realizing it. So people see a kid that is Black with a disability, maybe they have ADHD, but they're not seeing a child that needs help. They're seeing a child who's misbehaving.
Yeah.
And it might not be in their head that it's because they're a person of color, but a lot of times the difference is if the kid was white, that wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have been disciplined for that behavior. Whereas people of color are more marginalized in that. And the support needs to be in education for those people to realize, like to see their bias and be able to grow from that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the intersection of racism and often ableism, because white students with disabilities receive different, data has shown that white students with disabilities receive different responses to behavior infractions, if you will, than Black students with disabilities. And so we see that's the intersectionality of ableism and racism, right? That what you're highlighting. And so we wanted,
and you see in school, like I used to work in school and you see it all the time. Oh, well, this student has a disability, they need help. But then when there's a student of color with the same behaviors, he needs to go to the office, he's misbehaving. And that's where the change really needs to happen. And it's not just the marginalization of race, it's all of the pieces. It's a puzzle that you need all of the pieces for it to be a pretty picture.
Yeah, thank you.
Just to reiterate, this is Rita from Chicago, PTI Family Resource Center. Just to reiterate what this wonderful person was highlighting, in Chicago, we have schools that have metal detectors. Elementary school, how scary is that for a kindergartner to put their bag on a belt? And it's mind-boggling to see those things. We have so many SROs versus paraprofessional in certain schools.
Okay.
And that is also mind-boggling. So we have IDEA that's supposedly protecting the rights of students with disability with provision of free appropriate public education. But when we look at it from an analysis lens and dissecting the layers of all of it, it is not proportional. It is not appropriate in my personal and professional opinion in certain instances, simply by not, they talking about, this is when they say they, the teams, when we are in IEP meetings supporting a family, all best practice, due diligence, et cetera, it is not. We do not have evaluators in native language. And in Chicago, I think like every other states, we have a large platforms of languages and we are struggling to find evaluators. How can we identify the strengths as much as the needs of a child who is not proficient in English?
Yeah.
And we just slap the DD or the LD inappropriately on that child that carry on for years. And the time you find out that was wrong, I would say it's late. It's very late.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And that's the intersectionality of race and ableism. That's what we're talking about. Those are the systems of oppressions that we're talking about. Thank you so much for sharing your examples. And then, so let's now move forward with our time that we have left to talk about then what can we do about it? The first thing that we can do about it is begin to demonstrate what the research calls critical consciousness, and that's cultivating a culture of inquiry. In other words, asking the right questions of ourselves and of our organizations and systems that we're working with. So critical consciousness is a self action, and it's also a systems action. Considering intersectional approaches when we're supporting families and students requires us to engage in intersectional analysis, engage in intersectional advocacy, and engage in intersectional interventions. And all of these approaches are put in place to combat intersectionality or the intersections of systems of oppression. We talk about intersectional analysis. We're talking about, so these are some actions that you can take when you're working with families and with schools to collaboratively identify and discuss what are anticipated barriers that may interfere with students and families' success in school, including making friends, getting to know coworkers, if students are, working and supporting the community, completing assigned responsibilities, so on and so forth. So to engage collaboratively with families and school personnel in discussing what are some of those anticipated barriers. And it's really critical that families and students of color or families and students who also possess other marginalized identities are a part of those conversations, because they are the ones that can identify what those anticipated barriers are. It's really difficult for school personnel. The majority of our school personnel are white, and the majority of our educators are white women. And so it's difficult for them to identify all the barriers because it's not a part of their lived experiences. So we need to have multiple perspectives and multiple voices at the table who will bring to bear different lived experiences that can better identify what those barriers may be. The second approach is intersectional advocacy. And this is where you're expressing concerns that are related not only to disability, right, but also advocate to support issues, support students and families to address issues that are associated with other identities as well. So in terms of language diversity, in terms of racial or barriers related to race or ethnicity, barriers related to religion. So we're not only thinking about disability, but we're thinking about we're advocating for other groups as well, because disability shows up in those other communities. Disability shows up in the African American, Latinx, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander communities, so on and so forth communities. Disability shows up in our LGBTQ communities. Disability shows up in our communities where rural communities or communities in locations where there's been considerable economic disinvestment. Disability shows up in all of those communities. And so we begin to advocate and to think about advocacy programs. We can't only think about it in terms of disability, we have to think about it intersectionally across all communities. And then intersectional interventions, supports and interventions that again go across and take into account multiple identities. So when we think about interventions such as school-wide interventions such as positive behavior supports or such as MTSS, multi-tier system supports, asking those questions related to how is the core instruction that students are exposed to at that tier 1 level, how is that instruction addressing and reflecting the lived experiences, the representation of our Latinx students, of our African-American students, of our Black students from Somalia, of our students from Persia, or our students from the Middle East. So whatever different communities make up that school community, how is the core instruction reflective of those representations, of those experiences? How are the opportunities reflected in the social opportunities reflecting the interest of the students with those communities? And so we think about not just the intervention itself as if the intervention is culturally neutral, because no intervention is culturally neutral. All interventions are really anchored in a particular cultural worldview. What we want to do is expand that worldview, because often the worldview is that of the white middle class, native English speaker, Christian, a male perspective. So how do we co-create by expanding the perspective of those interventions? And so we're taking an intersectional approach. I'm going through this fairly quickly because I don't want to run out of time. So reflecting an intersectional approach begins with, again, demonstrating that critical consciousness. And that means the ability to analyze the social conditions in ways in which people who possess multiple intersecting identities may experience marginalization, and then to identify how they may experience and then do something about it, right? Together, collaboratively with parents and school personnel and community members and students to do something about it. So first, the ability to analyze and to perceive what those conditions are, those marginalizing conditions are across different identities, and then to come together and work to address those issues. Practices that are related to, that really demonstrate critical consciousness. So the ability to explore your own culture, including your own family and professional background, to identify the stereotypes that you may have or biases. It's really important that we all are more in tune with our own identities, more in tune with our own biases. As we become more attuned, we sort of we model for others how they can be more critically reflective, right? How they can be more perceptive of various different identities and different experiences, how they can be more open to identifying their own biases. And then also how the system may then be supporting various different groups or not supporting groups based on those biases. To empathize and care for participants or care for diverse groups, specifically around various different marginalized identities. To demonstrate flexibility and responsiveness and the willingness to learn from others, right? To position ourselves as learners and to exhibit what's called cultural humility, the ability to regard our clients, our students, our families as cultural informants, that they know more about their lived experience than we do. So when they share ways that they've been marginalized, that we open ourselves up and we listen. And as consultants, as team providers, in your position, I know that you all, that's a part of your practice. What you may need to do is support educators to adapting that practice of cultural humility, and a model for them and support them, and really regarding their students and families as cultural informants, to believe families, to believe students when they say they're experiencing marginalization, not only based on their disability, but based on their other identities as well. What it means to apply an intersectional approach is really recognizing the whole person, recognize that we all carry multiple identities, and because of those identities, our lived experiences are unique, right? So we're not making assumptions. There's certainly some common practices, but there's certainly some unique experiences, and how my disability is mediated by my other identities. The way I experience my disability is mediated by other experiences. That we are focused not only though on needs, but that we're focused on the cultural assets and the cultural strengths. And so one of the ways that we think about intersectional approaches and supporting educators is to help them reframe from a deficit perspective as it relates to disability, and also relate to other marginalized identities, to a strength and asset base. My disability is not a deficit for me. My disability is a part of who I am. I draw strength. There are various different tools and resources that I have learned from the disability community and that I use to navigate my world. There's ways in which I need to be innovative to get things done in my life, and that comes out of being a disabled person. But it also comes out of my racial identity. It also comes out of my gender identity. And so there are strengths that's associated with my identities as well. And it's important that we communicate those strengths to our students, particularly our students with disabilities, and particularly our students of color with disabilities. So often disability is stigmatizing, and it's stigmatizing so often for students of color, because they're navigating both racism and they're navigating ableism. And the thing to do when you're confronted with challenging situations is to try to push back. But if we can support our young people to really prizing and valuing not only their racialized identities, valuing their language identity, valuing their gender identity, but also valuing their disability identity, then we will see that stigma go away. to address barriers and understand that there are different barriers that people have to navigate based on their multiple identities. And with those barriers comes various different risks. Again, to honor the cultural practices and histories, and to keep in mind the culture is dynamic and ever evolving. I know we're at time, so I do want to honor that. So I will send my my PowerPoint, but these are some other questions that as you look through and think about cultivating critical consciousness that you want to be aware of. You know, how are you demonstrating, acknowledging, being responsive to students and families, recognizing the differences and the risks associated, seeking information about the concerns related to disability and also other identities, and of course, assisting our families and students in finding resources to address the intersecting barriers to access and opportunities related to their disability as well as their other identities. And so with that sort of rush through really quick closing, I thank you all very much for engaging in this conversation with me. You've all been great. I wish we had more time, and I'm certainly always open to coming back. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to start the recording so I can do a few comments before we go on break.